Okay, I'm going to have to give credit where credit is due. Ayn Rand's name lurks at the fringes of the American psyche. Most Americans encounter her ideas from her fiction, most notably Atlas Shrugged. And they cling to her arguments to defend liberty and capitalism because Americans know they are being dragged down the path of collectivist disaster. And they observe that virtually no one in public life offers a defense of the principles on which America was founded. So when Americans read John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged, those words, his words, ring very deep in our rugged individualist souls. And Ayn Rand's unequivocal condemnation of statist power fills our hearts with cessationist pride against tyrannical and despotic governments. But there is one very large caveat. Americans trip over two central issues in Rand's work: selfishness and atheism. The moral condemnation of selfishness has been so drilled into the American psyche that we tremble and shake with terror when we think that selfishness is morally good. And this fear pales against the thought of rejecting God and church. People equate church with morality, so to reject God is to reject morality, and to reject morality is to embrace anarchy. As far as Americans are concerned, atheists are the poster children for immorality. American Christians are committed to the premise that if God isn't extorting people with eternal damnation and suffering, how can men possibly act morally? How will men know they are supposed to sacrifice for the greater good if God isn't condemning them with burning forever in a lake of fire? Americans want liberty and freedom, but concede that man must sacrifice for the greater good and renounce his individuality. Man must sacrifice his liberty such that all men can be equal. Never once do they notice that they are conceding the socialist, Marxist, statist premise. Man must sacrifice his existence to the collective. And so, like all schizophrenics, Americans cannot resolve the fundamental break between stated, and you know what, I need to do this, between stated worldviews. They cannot reconcile the commitment to individual liberty, property, and reason with the traditional values of sacrifice, determinism, and mysticism. Since Americans live in an altruistic world, a world where sacrifice is held out as the highest moral ideal, someone who rejects altruism and defends selfishness falls into a category somewhere between the devil and a circus act. People can't help but read Ayn Rand's words in awe, but they will perform extra acts of sacrifice just in case God is watching. As a writer, I have a specific admiration for her fiction. Atlas Shrugged is very likely among the top 5 literary achievements in all of human history. The Fountainhead and We the Living are also profound displays of the craft of fiction. In addition, Ayn Rand spent 20 years in Hollywood as a successful screenwriter. But these are not among Ayn Rand's greatest achievements. Not her fiction, not her thoughts on selfishness, and not her defense of individual freedom. Indeed, her greatest achievements will never be known by most men. Ayn Rand solved the central historic philosophical problem, these central historic philosophical problems: the problem of universals, the soul-body dichotomy, and since it bears directly on this conversation, the problem of free will, or really and truly the problem of determinism. So the question you will have to answer for yourself: do you reject ideas out of hand merely because they come from an unbeliever? If the answer is yes, then I must ask, what do you do with the fact that Christianity is based on Plato's philosophy? The relationship between Plato and Augustine is irrefutable. The relationship between Platonic thought and Christian doctrine is irrefutable. What do you do with the fact that the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity is based on the philosophical framework of Aristotle? that without his specific use of the word logos and the specific use of his word essence, we would not have the doctrine of the Trinity as we know it. How many of you have accepted historic Christian doctrines without so much as a hint of protest, knowing that Augustine got his doctrine from Plato? So here's the challenge that I have before me. Those are effectively rhetorical questions, and I'm going to have to leave them up to you to decide. You can accept what I have to say about this or not. That is actually your choice. And since I believe in free will, you will be making the choice about the value of the ideas that I'm going to develop and offer here. But I do have this specific challenge. It is impossible for me to give a full evaluation of Ayn Rand's work in this context. I don't have the time, and more importantly, I don't really think I have the skill. Besides, she has explained these ideas far better than I ever could. And there are two formal presentations that come from two readily available sources that I highly recommend. Now, these are not mainstream in her work, unfortunately, but they are essentials to understanding her overall thought. The first one is the Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and the second one is Objectivism and Philosophy in Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. Now, for the most part, what you're going to hear is me distilling her presentation, much like I have distilled Aristotle and Plato and the other thinkers throughout history. I am going to insert some editorial comments, and I'll try to make an effort to point out when I'm making an editorial comment and it's not her thought, okay? Because I want to try to present her ideas without any embellishment. But for me to explain the concept of her thoughts on free will requires I introduce the core of her ideas. To gain an appreciation for what she said and why she said it grows the longer I study the evolution of Western thought. Now here, I will tell you this. It has taken me a number of years to really come to an appreciation of why she said what she said. I honestly don't expect you. You're going to have to hear this a few dozen times before it really starts to sink in what she successfully did. So, objectivist free will. Ayn Rand starts with axioms. Her first axiom is, existence exists. This does not tell us anything about the nature of existence, only that existence is something. If nothing exists, then there is nothing to consider or know. The concept existence is the widest of all concepts. It subsumes every entity, action, relationship, or attribute. The concept existence covers what is known by a baby or a PhD. That there is something as against nothing. And it is at the identification of something that we must also identify consciousness. Consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. Consciousness is inherent in your grasp of existence. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. Before one can raise any questions pertaining to knowledge, its content or method, one must first be conscious of something. And here is Ayn Rand's formulation. For those of you who are actually watching online, I've got a slide up. For those of you on the radio, here's what she said. This is actually a quote by John Galt out of Atlas Shrugged. Existence exists, and the act of grasping this statement implies two corollary axioms. That something exists, which one perceives, and that one exists possessing consciousness. Consciousness being the faculty of perceiving that which exists. If nothing exists, there can be no consciousness. A consciousness with nothing to be conscious of is a contradiction in terms. A consciousness conscious of nothing but itself is a contradiction in terms. Before it could identify itself as conscious, it had to be conscious of something. If that which you claim to perceive does not exist, what you possess is not consciousness. Whatever degree of your knowledge, these two, existence and consciousness, are axioms you cannot escape. These are two irreducible primaries implied in any action you undertake. And any part of your knowledge, and in its sum, from the first ray of light you perceive at the start of your life to the widest erudition you might acquire at its end. Whether you know the shape of a pebble or the structure of the solar system, the axioms remain the same, that it exists and that you know it. And here is a third axiom implicit to the first two. It is Aristotle's law of identity. To be is to be something, to have a nature, to possess identity. To be something is to be the sum of its attributes or characteristics. A is the sum of the attributes of A. A is A. This is also a quote by John Galt in Atlas Shrugged. Whenever you choose to consider, be it an object or an attribute or an action, the law of identity remains the same. A leaf cannot be a stone at the same time. It cannot be all red and all green at the same time. It cannot freeze and burn at the same time. A is A. So here are the three axioms. This is the foundation of her metaphysic. Existence, consciousness, identity. Now, while I'm talking about this, think back over what I've talked about over the last 2 days. Think about how other philosophers have addressed these same issues and what distinctions they made. She sums up this axiom like this: existence is identity and consciousness is identification. This is the base level of the philosophical progression because these are axioms. They are irreducible. They have a built-in defense. To invalidate an axiom requires the use of the axiom. What this means is, and then in every effort to either invalidate existence requires the use of existence to try to invalidate it, or the invalidation of consciousness requires consciousness to invalidate itself, or the invalidation of identity. In all points and in all intersections of all arguments, all these three are required: identity, consciousness, existence. Here's what Ayn Rand said about axiomatic concepts. The identification of a primary fact of reality which cannot be analyzed, that is, reduced to other facts or broken down into component parts. It is implicit in all facts and all knowledge. It is fundamentally given and directly perceived or experienced, which requires no proof or explanation, but on which all proofs and explanations rest. Now, this is something you guys on the radio can't see, but I have a PowerPoint slide with effectively 4 triangles, and I'm trying to dazzle you with my PowerPoint skills. Yeah, it looks like a Christmas tree, but here's what I couldn't figure out how to do. I'm trying to illustrate that each level, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, they all rest one atop the other. The foundation of metaphysics is what gives rise to epistemology, which ultimately gives us ethics, and finally politics, okay? Now, I deliberately made epistemology much larger than the others, because epistemology ends up being the largest branch of philosophy. Ayn Rand's metaphysics is actually very terse: existence, consciousness, identity. Everything else flows up from here. Here's where we start, all right? So for you on the radio, I hope that gave you some idea what we're looking at here. Now, what I did in this instance, the same tree, the same evolution, each a foundation of the other, but in this instance, my triangles say existence / consciousness equals identity in the metaphysical triangle. The means and validation of knowledge, which is epistemology, action in accord with good, which is ethics, and sanctioned force, which is politics. So it is here that philosophy gives an abstract statement. It is at the metaphysical level that philosophy gives an abstract statement of the self-evident. So now we're going to move on to causality as the corollary of identity. Now we're just at about the time we're going to go from metaphysics up to epistemology. We're just about in this area as we're traveling up. Before a child, this is Ayn Rand again, she says, before a child can distinguish this object from that one, he holds an implicit concept, identity. As a child, this is an informal concept, but implied from the process of differentiation. He is working through the chaos of sensations and perceptions to integrate existence into objects. And here's where he arrives at the implicit concept entity. So if you can understand this, and she is extrapolating as an adult what happens at the most fundamental level of perception. And one of the implicit concepts that arises here is identity. A baby begins to distinguish between the chaos of existence and starts to distill it down into individual items, entities. The grasp of entity and the grasp of identity are what give rise to the principle, the law of causality. Now this is my editorial. You will remember when in one of my first lectures I discussed Aristotle, and I said that Aristotle correctly identified that we do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why. That is to say, its cause. That was Aristotle's concept. Notice that Ayn Rand is refining Aristotle's observation. Acquiring knowledge is the process of identification. A thing is an entity. The why of a thing is its causality. And causality is the principle of the law of identity. Do you see the relationship between these things? Yes? No? Okay, good. Okay, that's me ending my editorial. This is back to Ayn Rand's ideas. The child then grasps that an entity is a certain kind, a child then grasps that an entity of a certain kind acts in a certain way. Things act in a certain way and only in that way. As adults, we grasp this in a more formal way. Action is action of an entity. And the entity's identity equals A is A. Every entity has a nature. It's specific, non-contradictory, and limited. And this is important, limited. An identity is limited. In any given set of circumstances, there is only one action possible to the entity, the action expressed by the entity. This is the action caused and necessitated by its nature. I am now reading a quote from Ayn Rand, and she summarizes what I just said this way. The law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. All actions are caused by entities. The nature of an action is caused and determined by the nature of entities that act. A thing cannot act in contradiction to its nature. So now we're going to come back to my philosophical triangles. This, what I just talked about, is the whole of her metaphysical statement. Existence, consciousness, identity. This is the bottom triangle on my chart here. Now we're actually going to move on to knowledge, the means and validation of knowledge, which is epistemology. Everything that I just talked about, that is the foundation, and what we're going to talk about next rests on that foundation. Knowledge is knowledge of reality. Therefore, if the mind wants to know existence, it must conform to existence. By contrast, the historic epistemology has said that consciousness creates reality. But under this metaphysical premise, no science offering guidance to thought would be applicable. It's important you understand this. If consciousness is what creates reality, then there is no science to know reality. As such, the consciousness determines what that is. By definition, consciousness could assert whatever it wants, and reality would obey. Epistemology is the science that tells a fallible, conceptual consciousness what rules to follow in order to gain knowledge of an independent reality. And this is very, very important. Ayn Rand's contention is that the nature of human cognition, because it is finite and because it can error, it requires a very specific means and methodology of acquiring knowledge. Without such a science, epistemology, there is no answer to the questions, how do I know? And this is her ultimate insistence, that consciousness, human consciousness, has an identity. Every existent is bound by the laws of identity and causality. This applies to the material world, and it applies to consciousness. Any consciousness of any species, it is what it is. It is limited, finite, and lawful. It is a faculty with a nature. It is something that has to grasp objects somehow. The fact that consciousness has identity is self-evident. It is an instance of the law of identity. Now, this stands in contrast to the dominant historical philosophies that have insisted one of two things. We've had one of two options in the world. For consciousness to be valid, it must be limitless, omnipotent, or infinite. That is to say, consciousness can have no identity whatsoever. We were talking the other day about the issue of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. Well, really what those are saying is that there is a power of no limitation, a will of no limitation, a mind of no limitation. You see? A power, strength, a power of no limitation. Well, the moment you say something is infinite, it has no identity. The second option in history is that because man's consciousness has a specific nature, it is invalid. Most of the time in the determinists, particularly in the Christian worldview, the Christian Calvinist worldview, this is a pejorative. When they start talking about human consciousness being limited, they are really indicting man that because man doesn't know everything, he can have no confidence in his knowledge, in his knowledge base. This is ultimately saying that because man is limited, because he is finite, and because he doesn't know everything, that his knowledge cannot possibly be valid. Here's how Ayn Rand, sorry, I will get this name pronounced right, yeah. Here's how Ayn Rand summarized, and this is actually speaking of Immanuel Kant, who is the arch enemy of consciousness. Like I said yesterday, he separated man from his mind and his mind from reality, and here's how she discusses his arguments. His argument, in essence, runs as follows. Man is limited in consciousness of a specific nature, which perceives by a specific means and no others. Therefore, his consciousness, man's consciousness, is not valid. Man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind, and the things he perceives do not exist because he perceives them. So let me give you a quick visual. Let me dazzle you once again with my PowerPoint skills. Can you all see that? I really hope so, because I worked really hard on this chart. So anyway, this right here is the historic distinction. This is how philosophy historically has divided. We have the Pythagorean soul-body dichotomy at the very top. On the left-hand side, I've got cosmic consciousness, which ultimately translates into mystical determinism. This would be, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, and the fundamental presumption is that the prime consciousness controls all. Matter equals evil. Man is a lump of evil flesh. And on the other side, I have an impotent consciousness. And this translates into materialist determinism. The laws of nature control all, and man is a billiard ball. All right, that is the historic. That's a summary of the historic, and then these are the people. That's the same exact chart for those of you on the radio. It's the exact same chart, but under mystical determinism, I've actually listed the people who have advanced this: Plato, Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Hegel, as examples. On the right side, the materialist determinists, we have Democritus, which I talked about in my first lecture. Marx, Hobbes, and Skinner. Marx and Skinner are effectively behaviorists. But this, again, dazzling you with my PowerPoint skills, is Ayn Rand's solution. Man has a consciousness of a certain identity. That consciousness is the faculty for perceiving existence. And that faculty is identification. Historically, philosophy has divided man in half, the soul-body dichotomy, and the world as a material evil. Well, what Ayn Rand has done is to integrate the whole of human existence with existence and consciousness. Man's consciousness is a consciousness of a certain kind, acquiring knowledge by a certain means. Man's consciousness has identity. Now, here's the crucial distinction. But existence does not do man's thinking for him. The senses perceive existence automatically, but they do not provide knowledge beyond the perception. To gain such knowledge, man relies on concepts. But conceptual knowledge is not automatic. The basic choice for all men is to exercise his conceptual machinery or not. And this is crucial. Man must make a choice to engage his conceptual faculty. I'm reading a quote from Ayn Rand. To think is an act of choice. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of life, you are free to think or to evade the effort, but you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that your reason is your means of survival. So that for you, who are human beings, the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think. As we have seen in historic determinist theories that held that for man to be free, his actions must be causeless. This was effectively Epicurus, so the Epicurean swerve. That for man to have an option at independent action, there had to be causelessness attached to his actions. But if actions are causeless, man is reduced to a lunatic who acts without reason. But if man's actions have causes, he is determined. But man's actions do have causes. He chooses a course of action for a reason. He chooses the causes that shape his actions. To say that a higher level choice was caused is to say that there was a reason behind it, but the other reasons were possible under the circumstances, and the individual himself made the selection. He made that selection on a set of values. And this is the central issue for man in regard to action. A man's choice, one that he must make in every issue, is to act in accordance with his values. A man can accept a set of values yet betray them in action. He can actively evade taking the steps required to achieve his values, or he can abandon the responsibility. He can choose a life of mental fog, drop purpose, and brush aside knowledge to surrender to the moment. This kind of man lets himself drift through a day or a life pushed by random factors. But the fact remains that he chose the state. This is the root of taking no action is still an action. No choice is still a choice. So if man is and her conclusion is that ultimately man is a self-mover. He is a prime cause. His inviolable freedom lies in this issue. What kind of cause moves man? So now we're going to briefly discuss the law of causality and its relationship to choosing whether to think or not. According to Ayn Rand, the law of causality operates without breach. But the form of the operation, when applied to consciousness, is unique to the issue of the primary choice, to focus or not. Man is confronted with the facts of reality, and he has the fundamental choice. Does he focus on the facts of reality, or blur. And this is his fundamental choice. The law of causality, and this is actually very important. The law of causality affirms a necessary connection between entities and their actions. But here's what it does not do. It does not specify a kind of entity or a specific kind of action. Remember, Democritus ultimately said that the whole world and even man was effectively a billiard ball. Yes? Remember that? What he's ultimately equating is that the law of causality necessarily applies that all men or operate just exactly like the billiard ball metaphysic. But this is not true. It does not say, the law of causality does not say that only mechanistic relationships can occur. And it does not say that the universe is made up of billiard balls. The law of causality does not inventory the universe. It does not tell us what kinds of entities or actions are possible. The law of causality only tells us that what entities there are, those entities will act in accord with their nature. And whatever actions there are, those actions are determined by the entity which acts. The law of causality does not affirm or deny the existence of two reducible choices. No, I'm sorry. The law of causality does not affirm or deny the existence of an irreducible choice. The law of causality only says that if an irreducible choice exists, then the choice is a form of action, and the action is performed and necessitated by an entity of a specific nature. Now, this is very important. The law of causality is not an axiom. The law of causality is the law of identity in action. This differs vast. This is a vast difference between the historic assumptions about determinism, particularly the mechanistic determinists. They have treated the law of causality as if it is an axiom, that it's irreducible, and man is effectively subject to it at all points and at all times. But that's not what the law of identity or law of causality says. It is not axiomatic, and ultimately the law of causality is merely identity in action. And it's actually very simple to see. If you have a billiard ball table with billiard balls on it, and you use a cue stick on them, they will act in a certain way. Now replace all the billiard balls with eggs or balloons. And ultimately, what you're really seeing is that the nature of the action represented in any given instance is related to the entity in action. Do you see the distinction I'm making? Yes? Okay, cool. Outstanding. So now let us turn to the issue of free will. Actually, the question is really, can you prove free will? So let's think about this question for a minute. For determinism to be true, the content of man's mind must be automatic. There is no means of knowledge. Whatever you have in your head, if determinism is true, whatever happened in your head is determined to be there by no action, no effort, no methodology of your own. Yes? You understand that? Okay. The forces operating on existence means that those same forces are filling the determinist mind. So every neo-Calvinist that stands up and just begins to advocate determinism, he must presume that the content of his mind is infallible, because he didn't put that content there. Never forget this. According to the determinist, the content of man's mind is automatic. So to speak of proof as a determinist, to ask for proof, is inconsistent. In this context, it's irrelevant. Determinism invalidates the whole field of epistemology. Let me back up briefly. Epistemology, the means and validation of knowledge. Determinism invalidates this whole area of knowledge. Because since knowledge is automatic, it's the product of the determinist force, what's to study? What's the means to know? What's the means to validate? There cannot possibly be one. So when a new Calvinist, or any determinist, when they demand proof, they are betraying their premise. There is no validation of knowledge because there is no methods to guide a man's thoughts. There is no such thing as justifying ideas. So this is an editorial. This is certainly not in Ayn Rand's stuff, but I'm going to put it in context of what we're doing here. Let me put this in terms of the TANC conference and New Calvinists. Determinism, I'm going to make this very personal for people. Determinism invalidates the whole of biblical study. What you know about the Bible is determined by forces beyond your control. So what you know, the stuff rattling around in your brain must be infallible. The ideas can't be wrong because you can't be wrong because you didn't put the stuff there. There is no such thing as proving the inescapable. For the same reason, there is no such thing as proving heartbeats or breathing. There is no alternative but to submit to the involuntary. And notice that when you talk to a new Calvinist, have you ever noticed how condescending they are? They know the secret, and you're just the poor spiritual schlub that hasn't been led into the cool kid club. The reason they act this way is because they presume that their understanding is infallible. Now, don't let the false humility trip you up. Whatever protest they make to being an intellectual worm is all posturing. For all practical purposes, they believe that what they believe is infallible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
They can't prove that.
Huh?
But they can't prove it.
They can't prove it, but that's
by
what they
their
believe.
own definition, they can't prove it.
You're exactly right.
Neither can they prove that you're wrong.
Exactly right. Because by definition, everything they believe is determined by forces that they cannot control. As a good Calvinist predestinationist, I'm not sure it's predestinationist or... yeah, it is. They must presume exactly this. Now, if pressed, all determinists must concede that their minds may not grasp the facts, that they have no way to choose reality over fantasy or lies, unless they have a means to acquiring knowledge. Determinists must concede that they can commit error because the mind does not automatically stay attuned to revelation or the environment or biology, right? The fact that knowledge is not automatic, the fact is that knowledge is not automatic. That it must be acquired is the very root of free will. I'm going to say that again as soon as I rearrange my papers. The fact that knowledge is not automatic, that it must be acquired, is the very root of free will. This is, of course, I should have told you when I changed from editorial back to Ayn Rand's position. The fact that knowledge, or said another way, man must take action to acquire knowledge. And because man is not infallible, he must have a means to assure himself that his knowledge is correct. Remember what I said? Epistemology is the science of the means and validation of knowledge. Because consciousness has an identity, and that it acquires knowledge by a certain means, he must have the ability to, he needs a science that tells him how to validate his knowledge. And for that to happen, volition is required for validation. I'm going to pop real quick to my end. So the request for proof betrays the inescapable axiom of validation, or volition. Volition is the starting point for all conceptual action. Volition is the starting point of epistemology. For man to direct his consciousness, man must be free to direct his consciousness. A man must direct his consciousness because he must validate the content of his conceptual knowledge. Men must think in order to know. The content of man's mind is not automatic, so man must find a means to assure that what he knows is valid. Man has a need to validate his ideas in the middle of a desert, or on the moon, or in a TANC lecture. It doesn't matter where a man is located. He must validate his ideas because his mind is the primary faculty for survival. The questions would be on a desert, out in the middle of the desert, should I eat those berries I found on a cactus? How could I know? I need a method to validate whether that's true or not. Will the berries cause harm or will they sustain life? How can man validate his knowledge? Once man lands on the moon, can he get back off its surface? How can he validate that knowledge? How can he know what he knows is true? And this is the essence of epistemology. And I have actually broken down epistemology in its fundamental elements that I've identified so far. So the request for proof betrays the inescapable axiom of volition. Volition, I think I already read this. Hang on a second. The answer is man must validate all of his knowledge, and to validate means he must take action towards that end. In other words, validation rests on volition, and volition is self-evident, which means it is an axiom. So now let's briefly discuss the issue of proof. Notice I put proof out here on the edge. Perception, knowledge is hierarchical, right? So we have the metaphysical premises, right? Now we're actually moving into epistemology. The foundations of epistemology are perception. We then move up into volition. Man must take action. He must be free to take action. We get to validation, but validation is the broad category of understanding knowledge. Proof is just a touch different. Proof is reducing, is a subcategory of validation. It is the process of developing a proposition from preceding knowledge. To prove something requires visiting each concept step by step until you reach axioms. Proof takes premise upon premise, concept upon concept, until it reduces down to its most basic intersection with perception. So now I'm going to editorialize briefly. This is exactly why scripture stacking debates are miserable failures to prove free will. Let me briefly discuss reduced scripture stacking down to its base level. The New Calvinist points to his Bible passage and says, it clearly says right here, blah, blah, blah. And a frosty Arminian says, yes, but the Bible clearly says right here, blah, blah, blah. The Bible passage is being offered as proof, but they are not offering validation from preceding knowledge. The Calvinist and the Arminian are both appealing to authority. This is the real thing that they're appealing to. This is not previous propositions. What they are really doing is saying, by authority, because the Bible says something, you must change your mind. But this edict for rational subordination rests on rational confidence founded on layers and layers of preceding concepts. When a new Calvinist says, the Bible clearly says, he is really saying that his interpretive methodology makes the conclusion in his mind clear, and it should be clear for you. He is demanding your rational subordination to his interpretive methodology. But what he is overlooking is the specific process, the methods of his thinking to arrive at his conclusions. He is taking those methods as a given. For instance, he is taking as a given Luther's historical redemptive hermeneutic, so that he can rewrite reality to fit his own conclusions. For instance, he has already answered questions like, is the Bible meant to be read literally, always, in every passage? Is the Bible meant to be figurative, always, in every passage? Do all recorded sayings have the same importance? For instance, are the words of Job's friends on the same authoritative level as God talking to Satan? His means of answering these preceding questions are the assumptions that he approaches canon. This is his interpretive methodology. So before cracking a Bible open and randomly stabbing a finger at a passage, The new Calvinist has already acquired a long conceptual chain of conceptual conclusions. And all of these intellectual conclusions rest on man's primary mean of disseminating complex information, namely the ability to read. Educator Susan, question for you. How many conceptual integrations are required to learn to read? Ballpark it for me. How many conceptual integrations are required to learn to read? Where to start, right?
Where to start? You have to have
recognition.
You gotta know the
pattern
meaning of each
recognition,
word.
sound, phonemology. You have to have phonemology. You have to have
Association.
oh, mercy sakes alive.
Yeah, do you see the point that I'm trying to make? Just the conceptual apparatus of reading requires a vast conceptual understanding, right? So you have to know that before you can ever get to a scripture stacking debate. So knowledge is hierarchical. The ability to read is actually the foundation of the scripture stacking debate. Before you can...
The ability to read, though, is not the ability to understand what you read. And the comprehension is a whole other aspect.
Right. So you have the relationship between sounds, letters, then words, right? And from words, we have ultimately words are the conceptual designations of concepts, right? And so then we have to learn many concepts, right, to expand our vocabulary. So now you can begin to see. Now you can begin to see how the means and validation of knowledge, why it is so vast. Because ultimately, all of these conceptual things are stacked one upon the other, upon the other, upon the other. Before we ever get to doctrinal discussions, you had to have had a vast number of conceptual integrations available in your mind before you could ever get to a Bible passage and go, "Thus says God." And this is exactly why, that is why this is not proof. We're not discussing proof when we're stacking Bible verses. We're discussing concepts that have nothing to do with original premises. So when a new Calvinist says, what the Bible clearly says, blah, 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 his appeal to authority is really an appeal to his own literacy. This is the dirty little secret that no one wants to pay attention to. And literacy is based on the volition to acquire conceptual knowledge, and conceptual knowledge is rooted in validation. And validation is rooted in volition, and volition is rooted in perception. You can begin to see how this hierarchy of understanding, each thing builds upon another, builds upon another. So now let me return to my last comments on free will. Notice now that every scripture stacking debate starts with volition. All the way down here in the progression. It starts here. Before we ever get to validating scriptures way up here, we actually must start with volition. Volition is axiomatic because all conceptual knowledge rests on a method of validation. Right? Volition, validation. The need for validation is required for a consciousness that can focus his faculty of reason or unfocus his faculty of reason. In other words, he needs a method of validation because consciousness has identity. Therefore, free will is inescapable. Even those who seek to attack free will must use free will because the location of man's will is his conceptual faculty. The faculty of reason is the faculty of volition. And volition is the faculty of free will. All right, I know I've said a lot, so I'm going to let you all ruminate, and that's all I got to say.